Hey Econ 200. In this video, what I want to do is apply the lessons we've learned about price controls to the situation in California in particular, although it's happening across the country, with shortages in grocery stores after COVID-19 broke out in the United States. Okay, now you can look at those shortages, and if you ask a person on the street why are those shortages happening, what they'll probably tell you is, well, we have a problem with hoarding. Okay, people are just buying up everything that's available, and that's the problem. There's panic buying, and so there's nothing left for ordinary people to who aren't panicking to purchase on the shelves. Turns out that is, I mean, that's partially right, but it lacks some of the lessons that we can learn from economics. So let's talk about why we're actually seeing these shortages in our shelves. Okay, so you've got a market, say the market for toilet paper, and initially it's in equilibrium, right? Demand tells us the price that buyers are willing to pay. Supply tells us the prices at which sellers would be willing to sell a certain number of units. Where they meet in the middle, that gives us the equilibrium, right? So this price, PE, at that price, sellers would be willing to sell exactly the number of units that buyers would be willing to buy, and that looks like fully stocked shelves. That's what we're used to seeing in stores, is this equilibrium. Okay. Now, what happened in California in the last couple of weeks? Well, on March 9th, the governor of California, Gavin Newsom, declared a state of emergency. And it turns out that under California law, when either the governor declares a state of emergency at the state level, or if the president declares a state of emergency at the national level, under either of those two circumstances, our anti-price gouging laws go into effect. Price gouging is raising your price when there's a crisis or when there's an emergency. Okay, and it's against the law in California to do that. Now, technically speaking, when these laws go into effect, firms can increase their prices by a little bit, somewhere between 5 and 10% of the price they used to be charging. They can increase by that amount. But for the purposes of illustration, we're going to assume that these laws just hold the prices fixed to what they were before. Okay, so Governor Gavin Newsom declares a state of emergency, and this old equilibrium price PE, that now becomes a price control, right? This is now the law. You can't trade at prices above that. Okay, that's one effect of what's happened. But notice what's going to happen probably on the buyer side of this market. Buyers know that we're in a state of emergency, and they know that, because of the spread of COVID-19, the supply lines are a little bit shakier than they used to be, and they're not 100% sure that stores are going to be open, in the short term. And so what are they going to do? Well, with goods like toilet paper, buyers might be a little more eager to buy toilet paper than they were before. That's going to look like a shift in the demand curve up and to the right, which just means that buyers, for any given quantity of units, they're willing to pay a higher price than they used to be willing to pay, or at a given price, they want to buy more units of the good, right? So consumers are savvy. They realize that, they might want to stock up right now. And initially, it might not be that big of a deal, right? It could be that buyers don't demand that much more toilet paper than they did before. But we get this shift in the demand curve from D to D prime. Now notice that once that demand curve shifts, we're not in the old equilibrium anymore. Now, if you want to set up a situation where sellers are willing to sell as many units as buyers want to buy, you've got to let those sellers raise the price, right? What's happening under the price control is sellers are still willing to sell the same old number of units that they were before. Call that QS. But now buyers aren't demanding that number of units at this price. Now the buyers want more units at that price, right? Call that QD prime because we're on the D prime demand curve, okay? Now that is a shortage. If you allowed the market to adjust prices upward, two things are going to happen. First of all, buyers are going to demand fewer units. They're going to cut back on their consumption relative to what it is under the controlled price. So what does that mean? That means you're going to see less hoarding or less people showing up to the store and saying, you know what, I'm going to buy one more pack of toilet paper than I had planned, just in case. And on the seller side, as you allow them to raise the price, you encourage them to produce more of that product. And so those two forces are going to continue until you reach the new equilibrium. But because we're in a state of emergency and we've locked in those old equilibrium prices, this can't happen anymore. And you end up with a shortage of goods on the shelf. Now, this can be pernicious for a couple of different reasons. One is that the initial shortage can get worse because shortages can feed on themselves under these situations. Remember, we talked in class about the fact that consumers pay attention to their expectations of future prices. Like if they think prices are going to be higher in the future, they demand more of the product now because they're trying to avoid paying those high prices in the future. Okay, well, if they expect a shortage in the near future, if they know that now all of a sudden there's no guarantee when they walk into the store that there's going to be toilet paper on the shelves, well, they're going to demand more of that product now. They're going to want to buy, if they find any toilet paper in the supermarket, they're going to want to buy as much of it as they can right now so that they're not the ones who are hit by this shortage. Well, what does that mean? That means that demand is going to shift once again. And the shortage worsens. Call that QD double prime. Now there's even more quantity demanded at the old price than there was before, and so it becomes even more difficult for consumers to find the product that they wanted. Now, notice that if you had let the price increase to this equilibrium, you could have avoided this situation, because consumers would see, okay, it's more expensive to buy this product, but it's still on the shelves. And so, I don't need to panic buy and purchase even more of them. So you could have avoided shifting the demand curve to the right. There's an even bigger problem that's being caused by this, by the way, and that is this particular state of emergency is because of a pandemic. Right? It's because there's a dangerous virus going around that we want to avoid passing from one person to another. And a shortage, what happens in a shortage? Well, there's a crush of buyers. They all try to show up to a store as soon as it opens. And they're willing to stand in long lines close to each other, waiting for that store to open so that they can be the ones who actually buy the units that are for sale. And they're not among these consumers who are kind of left in the cold without being able to get anything. Okay, so what we want is a situation where fewer people are going to the stores, fewer people are in crowds, fewer people are waiting in lines. But because we won't allow the price to change, we end up with a situation where more people are in crowds, more people are waiting in lines. All right, so simple economic analysis would suggest you don't want to hold those prices low when you go into a state of emergency. You should allow the prices to adjust. They should be able to go up to the new equilibrium to avoid these shortages. Now, I posted thoughts to this effect on Facebook, and I got some pushback. Right? There was more than one person who disagreed with my policy proposal of allowing prices to increase so we can go to the new equilibrium and make sure that we still have toilet paper on the shelves and food on the shelves. And although I saw more than one person disagree with me, they basically all had exactly the same objection. Okay? And that was the following: won't the rich buy everything? If we don't impose these price controls, they're worried that the wealthiest people in the country will be able to buy up everything that's at the stores. The poorer people, which they generally seem to mean everybody who's not among the rich, they're going to be left out, and so almost nobody will be able to get the goods and services. Okay, I disagree with this. I think this is poor reasoning, and I'm going to give you my arguments against it. All right, so here's the first one. There aren't that many of the rich. Okay, by definition, we define rich to mean people above a certain threshold. Now, nobody on my Facebook feed was saying, well, the rich are the top 10% or the top 5% or the top 1%, but that's usually who we're talking about when we talk about the rich. Okay. Now, think about that fact. If you define the rich to be the top 5% of the income distribution, well, by definition, that's only 5% of the population. When it comes to something like toilet paper, the rich only have 5% of the butts. Okay, they're not going to be demanding 100% of the toilet paper under those circumstances. They have only 5% of the mouths. In fact, the rich tend to have smaller families than middle class and poor people do, and so they probably have less than 5% of the mouths. They're not going to need all of the food that's available. They're not going to demand all of the food that's available. So by definition, I think that's worrying about the rich getting everything is overblown. But more than that, we don't spend, by we I mean middle class people, the average American. We don't spend all that much on food and toilet paper. Okay, if you look at the numbers on the average amount that the typical U.S. household spends on food, it's only 9.7% of their income. Okay, and almost half of that, 4.7% of our income, is spent at restaurants. So only 5% of our income do we spend on food at supermarkets. Restaurant food is way more expensive. If you allowed the price of food, for example, at the supermarket to go up by 10%, or by say 15%, 25%, people could easily cut back on the amount of money they spend at restaurants, and they could cook more food for themselves. You could also cut back on other things like don't go to Starbucks as much, or buy your groceries, and when you get home cancel your cable subscription. There's a number of different things that you could do, the typical person could do, to cut other extraneous expenses from their budget so they could afford food. More than that, when you're talking about toilet paper, it turns out that toilet paper, we only on average spend less than 1% of our income on toilet paper. It's 0.14%. So again, if toilet paper doubles in price, if it triples in price, if it goes up by 10 times in price, that still would only be 1.5% roughly of our income that we would have to spend on toilet paper. Most people in the U.S. are going to be able to swing that. Okay, so this is not a situation where middle class people would get nothing and it would all go to the rich. Keep in mind also that yes, the rich are advantaged at buying goods when the price is high. That's absolutely true. They have more money. But the rich are also generally going to be at an advantage to buy goods during a shortage. Okay, why? Well, one thing is the rich are more connected to business owners. They have more resources and more money available. And so it's going to be more possible for rich people to bribe firm owners, right? If I'm really wealthy, I might be able to call up the owner of the Ralph's Grocery or the Target and say, hey, listen, I know I can't pay you a price higher than, $2 a roll for toilet paper, but I'll give you $500 if you hold aside a pallet of toilet paper and you sell that to me at the controlled price. Okay, that is going to be more difficult for the middle class and the poor to pull off. Secondly, the rich can afford to hire personal shoppers, right? You can afford to hire lower income people to go stand in lines for you and go buy up as much as they can at the controlled price at those different locations. So it's not as though if you're rich and the prices stay low and there's a shortage, you can't get your hands on more of the goods than ordinary people can. You're still going to be able to have that ability. Okay, so this concern about the rich getting everything, personally, I don't believe that it holds a lot of water. I think that generally speaking, the middle class would still be able to get as much of the product as they wanted at the new higher price. Okay, and I think that's a reasonable price to pay to avoid the shortages that we've been seeing and avoid the quickened spread of COVID-19. There is something to this concern, though, that I do think is noble and that is worth considering in more detail. But I think it requires a switch in focus, okay? Instead of worrying about the rich and the rich getting everything, it makes more sense to focus on the poor, right? Let's worry about the poor not being able to pay the new high prices, not the rich being the only people who can afford to pay the new high prices, because that's not going to happen. But you could, in fact, have situations where the poor can't afford to pay an extra 20% or 30% in grocery bills or for toilet paper or something like that. So if we're not holding the prices at their older, lower levels, what might we do instead? Okay, well, it's pretty simple. Give them money during the crisis. That's what we do under ordinary circumstances, right? That's what welfare checks are. That's what food stamps, or the equivalent, modern equivalent of food stamps, EBT cards are. In ordinary times, we don't look at the price of goods and say, that's too expensive for poor people to afford, so we're going to force the price to go down, right? If we did that, then even in ordinary times, we would see shortages of goods and services. Instead, what we do through the welfare state is we take some money from people who are wealthier and we give it to the poor, and we say, look, spend this on goods and services that you need. The prices are going to be whatever the market decides, but we will help you be able to afford to buy more of that than you could on your own, right? So this wouldn't even necessarily be that technically difficult to do. People who qualify for food assistance and for welfare payments, they already get a card called an EBT card, which is basically like a credit or debit card that just, it links up to an account that the government puts money into every month. And when you go to the store, you pull out your EBT card, you swipe it, and you're accessing funds from that account. Okay? Well, it wouldn't be that complicated for the state of California to rewrite the law to say, look, during a state of emergency, we're not going to freeze the prices, but we are going to put an extra, I don't know, $250, $500, $1,000 into the EBT accounts of poor people who qualify. And if you're worried that these price hikes are going to affect more than just the very poor, the very destitute, you could give EBT cards to everybody, okay? And under ordinary circumstances, most people's EBT cards don't have any cash in their account. But when the crisis strikes and the governor declares a state of emergency, now for a limited period of time, there's going to be cash in that account that you can access. But you can't pull the cash out, but you can spend it at the grocery store. Okay, so I think that would be a much better solution. But the one thing you don't want to do is freeze the prices, right? You should let the prices adjust. Let me add the T there. Should allow the prices to adjust, and just do your best to make sure that you get enough resources into the hands of everybody to be able to afford to buy some amount of the product at those prices. All right, that's it for this video, guys. Thanks for watching, and remember, always be flexible, communicate, stay awesome.